Hi there. I'm Elsa, and welcome to the Sleepy Storyteller. Today, I want to share a tale with you that might not be quite what you're used to. It's a story about a life where vibrant colors and big events were few and far between. Instead, it's about the quiet, often mundane reality that shaped an entire era. So, settle in, let go of the day's hustle, and prepare to drift into a monotonous, yet insightful, world of the past. Personal hygiene and daily routines in the USSR. Personal hygiene in the Soviet Union wasn't just about cleanliness. It was a daily reflection of the country's economic realities and the pervasive nature of communal living. It underscored the constant struggle for basic amenities and the ingenuity required to maintain personal dignity amidst widespread scarcity. Communal bathrooms and shared spaces. For the vast majority of citizens, especially those residing in communalki, communal apartments, personal hygiene was intrinsically linked to sharing facilities. Bathrooms and kitchens were typically small, cramped spaces, often used by multiple families, sometimes up to half a dozen or more. This shared existence necessitated strict schedules and intricate unspoken rules, leading to constant negotiations and, inevitably, tension. Waiting for your turn to use the toilet, or the single, often dimly lit and poorly ventilated bathroom, became a daily ritual. The absence of privacy, the lingering smells of others, and the constant awareness of someone else waiting outside the door turned what should have been a private moment into a rushed, public affair. Even basic tasks, like washing dishes or brushing teeth in the communal kitchen, required navigating around neighbors preparing meals or engaging in their own chores. Limited access to goods. The idea of choosing between different brands of soap, shampoo, or perfume was utterly alien to most. Fancy soaps, nourishing shampoos, and delicate perfumes were rare luxuries, almost mythical items. If they were available at all, it was typically only in Berioska stores, which catered exclusively to foreigners and a select few Soviet citizens with access to foreign currency or special certificates. These goods might also appear, at exorbitant prices, on the black market, a testament to their desirability. For the general populace, basic toiletries were purely functional: a bar of plain, often harsh, laundry soap for everything from hands to hair, and a tube of toothpaste with a single, unvarying taste. Quality was an afterthought. The mere existence of the product was what mattered. This scarcity meant that personal care routines were stripped down to the absolute essentials, devoid of any indulgence or personalization. Banya, public bathhouses. For millions who lived without the luxury of a personal bathtub, or even consistent hot running water in their homes, the banya, public bathhouse, was not just an option, it was a crucial, indispensable part of life. The banya was far more than just a place to get clean. It was a social hub, a place for communal relaxation, and a vital weekly ritual for many families, especially on weekends. Here, people would meticulously scrub themselves, steam in the high heat, and perhaps even engage in the traditional practice of being beaten with birch branches, veniki, for improved circulation. Despite being a public space, the banya offered a unique sense of liberation and camaraderie. Dreams of Coca-Cola and Western goods. For many Soviet citizens, Western products, especially iconic ones like Coca-Cola, were far more than mere consumer goods. They symbolized an unattainable world of abundance, freedom, and modernity, everything that was so acutely missing from their daily lives. The allure of the West. Western goods were not just products. They were powerful symbols of a different, more prosperous life. Coca-Cola, jeans, chewing gum, and foreign cigarettes, each of these items represented a kind of forbidden fruit, alluring in its inaccessibility. Official propaganda consistently portrayed the Western world as decadent, decaying, and morally corrupt, yet at the same time, these items were secretly desired and evoked deep interest. They were the material embodiment of a different, better reality, one that could only be dreamed of. The taste of freedom. Coca-Cola, with its iconic red and white branding and recognizable taste, was largely unavailable to the general public for decades. Its appearance was an event, most often associated with special events, hotels for foreigners, or, far more commonly, with the black market. When a coveted bottle or can was acquired, it was savored, the pleasure prolonged. Drinking a Coca-Cola wasn't just about taste preference. It was about experiencing a small piece of the other world, almost a subtle act of rebellion or, at least, a moment of perceived freedom. It was an instant when a person felt part of a larger, unexplored world beyond familiar constraints. Fartsovka and the black market. The unquenchable desire for Western goods fueled the phenomenon of fartsovka and the flourishing of the black market. People known as fartsovshiki would illegally buy foreign goods from tourists, sailors, or other privileged citizens and resell them at exorbitant prices. This was a risky business, fraught with severe penalties, including imprisonment. However, the demand was so enormous that the risks were justified by the potential profit and the ability to satisfy this hunger for scarcity. Fartsovka became an integral part of the shadow economy, demonstrating the deep disconnect between official ideology and the real needs of the people. Propaganda versus reality. While official media tirelessly denounced Western consumerism, labeling it as vicious and empty, the visible allure of these goods, even if only glimpsed in Western movies, or during fleeting encounters with foreigners, created a powerful contrast with the drabness and scarcity of Soviet life. These dreams of Coca-Cola and jeans vividly highlighted the disconnect between the proclaimed utopian future, a communist paradise that never arrived, and everyday reality, filled with queues, scarcity, and limitations. Western goods became a silent, yet eloquent testimony that the world beyond this Iron Curtain was not as bad as propaganda painted it. Cooking and food in the USSR. Cooking in the Soviet Union wasn't about culinary experimentation. It was about resourcefulness and making do with what was available. The concept of deficit shaped every meal. The empty stores, supermarket shelves were often sparsely stocked. People learned to hunt for food, not just shop for it. This meant queuing for hours when a rare shipment of something desirable, like good sausage or butter, arrived. Creative substitutions, recipes were constantly adapted. If there was no meat, dishes like macaroni Navy-style pasta, usually with ground meat, would be made with canned fish, or just fried onions. "What we have, we eat," was a common saying. Preserving and canning, with fresh produce being seasonal and not always plentiful, home canning was essential. Grandmothers spent summers preserving jars of cucumbers, tomatoes, and fruit compotes for the winter. This wasn't a hobby. It was a necessity to ensure food security. The power of the BLAT system, getting good food, often depended on connections. Knowing someone who worked in a store, a warehouse, or a factory could grant you access to better quality or rarer products, bypassing the lines and general scarcity. Medicine in the USSR, between accessibility and harsh reality. Soviet medicine was not just a part of the healthcare system, it was one of the foundations of the state system, proudly proclaiming itself free and universal. Every citizen, regardless of status, could officially seek help, and this was presented as a great achievement of socialism, demonstrating the state's care for its people. On paper, everything looked ideal, from the simple local doctor in every district to highly qualified specialists and specialized hospitals, which, according to declarations, were absolutely accessible to everyone. However, in practice, this lofty ideal often clashed with harsh reality, creating a paradoxical system that was simultaneously a source of hope for some and profound disappointment for others. Polyclinics, gateways to a world of waiting. The path to a doctor for most Soviet people began at the polyclinic, which often became the first test. These institutions were overcrowded from early morning, when people began queuing almost before dawn to secure a consultation. The corridors were cramped, stuffy, permeated with the pungent smell of medicine, and a pervasive sense of overall, almost tangible fatigue of both patients and staff. Doctors, despite receiving a good basic education, often worked under colossal workloads. They simply had neither the physical capacity nor enough time for an individual approach to each patient. Consultations lasted mere minutes, diagnoses were made quickly, often without sufficient tests, or using outdated, poorly functioning equipment. The main task was not to delve into the core of the problem, but to see as many patients as possible, issue a formal referral, or a medical certificate. A feeling of indifference from the medical staff, exhausted by the flow of people and the chronic lack of resources, was commonplace, only exacerbating the sense of hopelessness among visitors. Shortage of medications, a hunt for survival. One of the most painful and disheartening problems of Soviet medicine was the chronic shortage of medications. Pharmacy shelves were often bare. Even the most basic preparations, such as simple antibiotics, effective painkillers, or even ordinary bandages and cotton wool became the subject of a real hunt. People would pass information to each other about thrown out newly available goods, stood in multi-hour queues, and relied on blatant, personal connections that could help obtain the necessary remedy. Imported medications were practically unavailable to the vast majority of citizens. They remained the privilege of a select few. This desperate situation forced people to resort to folk remedies, herbs, decoctions, compresses, grandmothers' recipes. Self-treatment became not an alternative, but often the only way out when official medicine, despite all its freeness, simply could not offer the required medication. Hospitals. A severe test of endurance. If a patient was referred to a hospital, Traditional medicine in the USSR, between tradition and forced necessity. In the Soviet Union, despite the officially proclaimed accessibility and freeness of official medicine, traditional medicine played an enormous, if not decisive, role in the daily lives of millions of people. It was not merely a part of a rich cultural tradition rooted deeply in centuries past, but often a forced necessity, turning into a kind of lifeline amidst the chronic shortage of medicines, the often low quality of service in overcrowded polyclinics, and a general, albeit unspoken, distrust of the state healthcare system. Grandmothers' recipes, knowledge passed down through generations. Knowledge about herbs, decoctions, tinctures, and compresses was passed down from generation to generation, most often through the female line from grandmothers and great-grandmothers. These recipes were not considered exotic or marginal. They were an integral part of everyday life and household management. For instance, at the first signs of a cold, people immediately began drinking raspberry jam with hot lemon tea. For coughs, mustard plasters were applied, or, what was particularly popular, Banks, cupping therapy, were used on the back glass jars that created a vacuum. For joint pains or muscle strains, alcohol tinctures made from various herbs, like cinquefoil or horse chestnut, were widely used for rubbing. Practically every family had its own carefully guarded arsenal of proven remedies, which they generously shared with neighbors and friends, creating an unspoken network of mutual aid in conditions of scarcity. Home first aid kit, not medicines, but natural remedies. The home first aid kit of a Soviet person, especially in the provinces, often consisted not so much of manufactured medicines as of natural remedies. On windowsills in large cities and in pantries in villages, hand-collected herbs would be dried fragrant chamomile, healing St. John's wort, soothing linden blossom, coltsfoot, and plantain. In refrigerators or on shelves, there were jars of jam, especially raspberry and cranberry, homemade honey, which was considered a panacea for many ailments. It was widely believed that honey, lemon, garlic, and onions were the best defense and cure for all diseases, from colds to flu. At the slightest ailment, be it a mild headache or the first symptoms of a cold, people first tried to cure themselves at home, and only if these methods did not bring relief, did they turn to the official polyclinic. This was not only a tribute to tradition, but also a pragmatic approach in conditions where a trip to the pharmacy often proved futile. Self-treatment and trust in one's own abilities. People in the USSR often engaged in self-treatment, based on their own, sometimes bitter, experience, advice from acquaintances, neighbors, or even articles from popular magazines like Zdorowy Health or Naukoidzin Science and Life, which occasionally published materials on the benef, the commute in overcrowded transport, and the loss of individuality. The journey to work wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a daily test of endurance, a challenge to both physical and mental resilience. Each day began with an immersion into the world of overcrowded public transport, which became a true act of physical violence against the individual. Whether it was a bus, a tram, or the metro, the scene remained the same. Hundreds of people, compressed into a steel box, completely deprived of any semblance of personal space. People weren't just standing shoulder to shoulder, they were literally pressed into each other, their bodies losing their outlines within the dense mass. Elbows, knees, backs, all merged into a single, moving organism. Every sudden break or turn threw you against a neighbor, and you, in turn, inevitably leaned on someone else. It was a constant, uncontrolled contact with other bodies, causing awkwardness, irritation, and a deep sense of helplessness. The air in this sardine can was stale and heavy, as if it hadn't been changed in ages. It was filled with a pungent mixture of smells, stale clothes, infused with the fatigue and hopelessness of countless days, dampness, which had permeated autumn coats and winter jackets, and the smell of collective despair, an invisible yet palpable presence hovering over the entire crowd. Every breath was an effort, the air felt thick and sticky. In this unbearable crush, individuality was lost. People ceased to be Vajra, Moshe, Petia. They became part of a faceless, amorphous mass, where the sole purpose was to get to work. A purpose that overshadowed everything else, transforming human bodies into tools for achieving this single objective. No one made eye contact. Gazes were fixed on nothing, avoiding contact so as not to acknowledge the shared humiliation. Everyone was part of a single flow, striving towards their destination, to avoid the worst punishment for being late. Fines, reprimands, loss of bonuses, these threats were real and hung over everyone, forcing them to endure daily torment. This journey wasn't just a trip from point A to point B. It was a metaphor for life under certain conditions, where an individual was merely a function, a part of a large mechanism, where their personal boundaries were erased, and their individuality dissolved into the general mass. Monotony of the workday, and the absence of meaning. The workday was not a source of self-realization, or an opportunity for growth, but a heavy obligation, often joyless and meaningless. Regardless of where a person spent their hours in a factory, a research institute, NII, or an ordinary state institution, the same merciless rules prevailed everywhere: monotony, strict control, and a complete lack of initiative. The motto of the day was the phrase, "from bell to bell." This didn't just mean the beginning and end of working hours. It was a principle permeating every aspect of existence. You arrived at work with the first bell, performed the assigned, often routine, sometimes absurd tasks, and waited for the second bell to finally be free. The essence was not in the result, not in the quality, but in the very fact of completion. Tasks had to be performed not because they had meaning or brought benefit, but because that's how it was supposed to be. It was an uninspired, sometimes mechanical activity, where the main thing was to observe formalities. A person's life was defined by a set of rigid criteria, norms, plans, the legendary 5-year plans. These words were not just economic terms. They were invisible chains shackling creativity and depriving work of personal meaning. Individual ambitions, the desire to improve or change something, the pursuit of innovation, all of this was suppressed. The main thing was not to stand out, not to violate the established order, not to take risks. Your value as a worker was measured not by creativity or an unconventional approach, but by the ability to strictly follow instructions. Any deviation from instructions, or even a harmless attempt to show initiative, could lead to serious consequences. At the very least, reprimand from superiors, public or private, which undermined an already fragile self-confidence. More serious consequences included loss of bonuses, which was painful for a modest budget. And in the worst case, especially during darker periods, it could even lead to denunciation, which could have unpredictable and extremely negative consequences, up to loss of job or freedom. The fear of possible punishment was a powerful tool, suppressing any desire to think differently or act outside the established framework. Such a system led to work becoming an exhausting obligation, devoid of internal motivation. People went to work to survive, to avoid punishment, to conform to the system, rather than to realize their potential or find joy in creation. Tasteless lunch and chronic hunger. Lunch in the canteen was not a moment of respite or enjoyment of food, but merely a necessity, a mechanical need to replenish calories for the continuation of an exhausting day. It wasn't a meal, but rather a fuel stop, devoid of any pleasure or taste. The first course, invariably schi or borscht. They were often without any hint of meat, cooked in water or the cheapest broth, with obligatory sour cabbage that dominated the taste, overpowering all other ingredients. They were usually served barely warm, in thick, chipped plates. The absence of meat made them watery and bland, leaving behind only a slight, fleeting warmth and the feeling that the stomach was full, but not truly satisfied. For the second course, a cutlet made of mysterious mincemeat was offered. Its origin remained a mystery. Perhaps it was yesterday's ground meat, or a mix of offal, or simply bread with added meat flavoring. It was always uniformly gray, dense, and lacking distinct taste. The side dish was just as predictable and unappetizing: overcooked pasta, stuck together in a lump, or stewed cabbage, soft, watery, and bland. No freshness, no texture, no variety whatsoever. All of it was tasteless, monotonous, prepared from the cheapest ingredients. There was no question of quality. The main criteria were mass production and minimal cost. The food did not please the eye, stimulate the appetite, or bring any enjoyment. It served only one function: to quell the chronic feeling of hunger that was a constant companion for many. This was not the hunger of a gourmand desiring to savor a taste, but a primitive, gnawing sensation of emptiness in the stomach. People did not eat for pleasure or joy. They ate to survive, to have the strength to continue working, to avoid fainting from exhaustion. Lunch in the canteen was another reminder of the gray routine, and the lack of choice in a life where even the basic need for food turned into a dreary obligation. The buy quest and humiliation in queues. A trip to the store after work wasn't just a routine, it was a real survival quest, full of humiliation. It was a daily trial where you fought not only for goods, but also for your dignity. Long, exhausting queues became an integral part of life, a symbol of scarcity and hopelessness. For every halfway decent product, multi-hour queues would form. The phrase, "they threw out," meaning, they put out for sale a scarce item, meant that a rare, or at least somewhat decent quality product, had appeared in some store. And then the race began. People were willing to stand for hours, often in the cold or rain, risking ultimately getting nothing if the item ran out right before them. It was a lottery where there were far more losers than winners. What was so valuable? Practically everything that even remotely resembled quality. Sausage, often containing more paper than meat, but still sausage, real butter, not the ubiquitous margarine. Good groats, without bugs or debris, shoes that wouldn't fall apart in a month, any decent clothing, not factory standard, but something with a hint of fashion, or just individuality. All of this was worth its weight in gold, obtained with enormous difficulty, and valued incredibly highly. People spent their evenings and weekends in these endless queues. This was time torn away from personal life, from family communication, from rest. A special atmosphere reigned in these queues, a mixture of feelings of despair, hopelessness, and injustice. People were humiliated, begging, pushing, getting into arguments over an inch of queue space, or a couple of packs of butter. It was everyone's struggle for themselves, where human relationships were reduced to primitive competition. The feeling that you were forced to live this way, that you were deprived of basic conveniences and choice, was a constant companion, poisoning every day. This system of cues was not just a logistical problem. It was a tool of control, a way to remind people who was in charge, and a daily humiliation that left an imprint on people's psyche. A dreary evening at home and the absence of personal freedom. An evening at home, which should have been an oasis of peace and personal space, in reality brought no comfort, but only emphasized the general hopelessness and lack of personal freedom. After an exhausting day filled with crowds and monotony, returning to a cramped communal apartment or a small flat simply meant exchanging one form of restriction for another. Dinner was a continuation of the day's struggle for survival. It consisted of whatever could be obtained through the arduous quest in stores, or from meager, carefully guarded supplies. There was no talk of variety or culinary delights. Food was merely a means of quelling hunger, not an occasion for joy or family gathering. Often, it was the same pasta or porridge, quickly prepared, without any enthusiasm. The television, if there even was one, offered an extremely limited choice of entertainment. Only 2 or 3 channels showed endless party congresses, tedious ideological programs praising the system's achievements, or outdated films where life was depicted as embellished, unreal, and far removed from daily difficulties. These programs only intensified the feeling of detachment, as the contrast between the on-screen, ideal reality, and one's own life was striking. There was no opportunity to choose something to one's liking, no freedom of information flow. Family conversations rarely went beyond discussing everyday problems, scarcity, and prices. Daily hardships, the inability to buy basic necessities, the lack of money, all of this created a suffocating atmosphere where personal dreams and aspirations faded into the background. Politics was whispered about, voices lowered, constantly looking over shoulders, fearing being overheard by neighbors living behind thin walls, or even by members of their own family, who might inadvertently blurt something out. This constant fear was an invisible, but powerful barrier, suppressing the free expression of thoughts and feelings. Weekends without choice and the escape from reality. Weekends, which for many should be a time of freedom, rest, and personal choice, were in this grey reality merely a continuation of the mundane routine, devoid of any bright spots. They didn't offer a sense of freedom, but rather became a continuation of exhausting household chores. Instead of well-deserved rest, people spent Saturdays and Sundays repairing leaky faucets, sealing windows, or endlessly cleaning cramped apartments. And of course, they again stood in queues, now for larger, but equally scarce purchases, if they even appeared on sale. This could be a refrigerator, furniture, or a carpet, items for which people were willing to endure any hardships and humiliations. If a family had a dacha, country house, it was not a vacation either. Trips there meant heavy physical labor, digging, planting, weeding, harvesting. The dacha was not a place for relaxation, but a way to grow something, anything, to feed oneself, to supplement a meager diet, to provide the family with potatoes, vegetables, or berries for the winter. It was another front in the battle for survival, where every piece of land was worth its weight in gold. The only available forms of leisure were parks and cinemas. Walks in the park, often monotonous and predictable, or watching films, most of which were ideologically sound and did not reflect real life, did not provide a sense of festivity. Rather, it was a way to escape the dreary reality, if only for a couple of hours, to forget about household problems and scarcity. It was a passive consumption of entertainment, not active participation in anything that brought genuine joy. The feeling of a lack of choice was pervasive and oppressive. The inability to freely plan one's leisure, to buy what one wanted rather than what was given, was a constant source of frustration. But the most pressing was the realization of the impossibility of leaving the country. The Iron Curtain was not just a metaphor. It was a real barrier separating one from the rest of the world. This created a persistent feeling of a vicious circle, a trap from which there was no escape. Life flowed along predetermined tracks, and any deviation from them was impossible, or extremely dangerous. Weekends, like all of life, were just a part of this endless cycle of hopelessness. Weekends without choice and the escape from reality. Weekends, which for many should be a time of freedom, rest, and personal choice, were in this grey reality merely a continuation of the mundane routine, devoid of any bright spots. They didn't offer a sense of freedom, but rather became a continuation of exhausting household chores. Instead of well-deserved rest, people spent Saturdays and Sundays repairing leaky faucets, sealing windows, or endlessly cleaning cramped apartments. And of course, they again stood in queues, now for larger, but equally scarce purchases, if they even appeared on sale. This could be a refrigerator, furniture, or a carpet, items for which people were willing to endure any hardships and humiliations. If a family had a dacha, country house, it was not a vacation either. Trips there meant heavy physical labor, digging, planting, weeding, harvesting. The dacha was not a place for relaxation, but a way to grow something, anything, to feed oneself, to supplement a meager diet, to provide the family with potatoes, vegetables, or berries for the winter. It was another front in the battle for survival, where every piece of land was worth its weight in gold. The only available forms of leisure were parks and cinemas. Walks in the park, often monotonous and predictable, or watching films, most of which were ideologically sound and did not reflect real life, did not provide a sense of festivity. Rather, it was a way to escape the dreary reality, if only for a couple of hours, to forget about household problems and scarcity. It was a passive consumption of entertainment, not active participation in anything that brought genuine joy. The feeling of a lack of choice was pervasive and oppressive. The inability to freely plan one's leisure, to buy what one wanted rather than what was given, was a constant source of frustration. But the most pressing was the realization of the impossibility of leaving the country. The Iron Curtain was not just a metaphor. It was a real barrier separating one from the rest of the world. This created a persistent feeling of a vicious circle, a trap from which there was no escape. Life flowed along predetermined tracks, and any deviation from them was impossible, or extremely dangerous. Weekends, like all of life, were just a part of this endless cycle of hopelessness. Holidays as an obligation and a facade. Even holidays, which by their very nature should have been days of genuine joy, merriment, and freedom from everyday worries, were in this system stripped of any true meaning. They transformed into a compulsory duty and a facade, where the outward display of loyalty was valued far more than true emotions. The main holidays were the May Day, International Workers' Day, and November 7th, anniversary of the October Revolution, demonstrations. These were not spontaneous expressions of civic spirit or popular enthusiasm, but a mandatory appearance from which it was practically impossible to abstain. The order from above was unspoken, but its consequences were very real. People marched in columns because they had to. It was a kind of civic duty that was performed under the threat of undesirable repercussions. Non-attendance at a demonstration could lead to serious problems. These could be problems at work. A reprimand, loss of bonuses, being blacklisted as unreliable, which could affect career advancement, or even lead to dismissal. But even more terrifying were problems with children's admission to universities. Refusal to participate in public life could be interpreted as disloyalty, and then the path to education for your child might be closed, thereby depriving them of a future. This fear was a powerful motivator, forcing people to put on their best coats, grab flags and placards, and march in the column, feigning enthusiasm. The holiday table, of course, was a little more abundant than usual. Perhaps one managed to obtain delicacies that were unavailable on weekdays, good sausage, sweets, something imported, if lucky. But even this abundance did not bring true merriment. It was not accompanied by a feeling of genuine celebration, but rather became an excuse to drink and forget for a while about the routine, the constant pressure, the hopelessness. Alcohol became a means of escaping reality, not an addition to a joyful event. This entire holiday atmosphere was for show, for reporting purposes. Photographs in newspapers, television reports were meant to demonstrate the unity of the people and their unwavering support for the party and government. But for the soul, it was not. These were days permeated with falsehood, where personal feelings were suppressed in favor of the system, and even in moments that should have been joyful, only a bitter emptiness and compulsion were felt. Dreams of the small and the unattainable, and hidden discontent. In this monotonous, strictly regulated reality, where every aspect of life was subjugated to the system, people clung to dreams. However, these dreams were primitively small and simple, reflecting not bold ambitions, but merely a deep longing for basic conveniences and minimal comfort, which remained an unattainable luxury. People dreamed of their own separate apartment, where they wouldn't have to share a kitchen and bathroom with strangers, where they could have at least some personal space. This was the ultimate goal for many, a symbol of dignity and independence from the communal hell. They dreamed of new furniture, not that which was inherited or obtained with incredible difficulty, but modern, comfortable pieces that would allow them to create coziness. The desire to buy decent clothes without queues, simply by walking into a store and choosing what they liked, rather than what was thrown out, put on sale, was not a whim, but an expression of the yearning for a normal life. And, of course, simple but much desired things like sausage without paper and proper butter were symbols of quality and abundance that remained only in dreams. However, alongside these modest hopes, there were also dreams of something unattainable. Trips abroad were practically impossible for the vast majority of the population. This was the privilege of the chosen nomenclatura, the party elite, and those close to power. For the average person, abroad existed only in pictures, in magazines, or in rare stories from the lucky ones who managed to go there. This feeling of confinement, of isolation from the world, was one of the most oppressive. These modest hopes, arising in the soul of every person, were often shattered by reality. Daily queues, scarcity, dismal living conditions, all of this mercilessly extinguished any glimmer of optimism. The constant confrontation with the unattainability of even elementary comforts gave rise to a deep feeling of hopelessness and injustice. This was not open protest, but hidden discontent that accumulated over years. It had no outlet, because any attempt to express it could be interpreted as anti-state activity and lead to severe consequences. This discontent lived within, corroding the soul, but remaining unspoken, which only intensified the feeling of being trapped and helpless. Awakening in grey reality and communal hell. Every morning didn't begin with the anticipation of a new day, but with the feeling that you were simply continuing yesterday's. The alarm clock didn't sing of opportunities or promise new horizons. It merely monotonously announced the start of another day, just like thousands before it. Waking up in a cramped communal apartment was an immediate plunge into a suffocating, inevitable reality. As soon as you opened your eyes, you faced the first manifestations of communal hell. The first obstacle was the bathroom. It was always occupied, or you rushed there yourself, hoping to beat the next neighbor by a few minutes. Queues for the single sink, wet footprints on the floor, strangers' toothbrushes, and soap, all of it completely stripped you of any sense of personal space. The shower, if there even was one, wasn't an oasis of cleanliness, but rather a place where you hastily washed off yesterday's fatigue, constantly listening for footsteps outside the door. Next, the path led to the communal kitchen, which greeted you with a kaleidoscope of smells. Here, the aromas of yesterday's borscht, fried fish, onions, burnt oil, and of course, the ubiquitous smell of boiling water for tea, all mingled. Every step was accompanied by the realization that you weren't alone, that your morning was just part of a common, collective script. Neighbors were already crowding around the stove. Someone was washing dishes. Someone was making noise cutting sandwiches. And here, in the midst of this morning chaos, you tried to find your tiny corner to prepare your simple breakfast. The main problem was privacy, or rather, its complete absence. The thin, cardboard-like walls of the communal apartment were invisible witnesses to all events. You could hear strangers' quarrels coming from behind the wall. You could distinguish words, intonations, even sighs. Children crying, shouting, indistinguishable whispers, all of it permeated your room, creating a feeling of constant presence that you couldn't escape. Your own conversations, your thoughts, your personal life, all of it potentially became public knowledge among your neighbors. Breakfast was the epitome of this gray, everyday life. It was an unchanging routine, familiar to the point of grinding teeth, designed simply to nourish the body for the day ahead. On the table, if you could call such a small, always cluttered corner that, lay gray, sometimes stale bread. Sometimes, if you were particularly lucky, you could spread a thin layer of margarine, which only vaguely resembled butter in its greasy consistency and yellowish hue. The only drink was tea, usually brewed quickly, without any frills. No culinary discoveries, no pleasant expectations from the food. Just a necessity, a mechanical replenishment of energy to endure another day, no different from the last. It was a routine that couldn't be escaped, and it defined every new day.